I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to address the the Billericay History Fair today from Leamington Spa in Warwickshire. It's a shame I can't be in Billericay in person for very obvious reasons, but at least I have an opportunity to talk to you all today. Now, a few days ago, one of my children was looking in the attic for something, and she came across a copy of the Billericay Observer, which I edited and published. That's not what she was looking for, but it was quite a find because I don't have many paper copies of the Billericay Observer left. Now, of course, if you want to see the copies, they are available in digital format on the Billericay Community Archive page, so you can just go there and read any you want to. But I was very interested to find this copy, and it's a copy from 5th of June 1962, and the paper was sold for 2 old pennies. Now so it's a way really of talking about what was happening in Billericay, what now seems like a very long time ago, almost 60 years ago, and to see what was preoccupying people at that time in the town. And the main story is about Billericay's hospital fate, which is proclaimed to be a big success, and indeed it was a big success in the sense that they sold 8,000 programs and sold even more on the day, and in fact they raised an amount of money, £800. Perhaps doesn't sound so much today, but if you look at the Bank of England inflation calculator, you can work out what that is, and it's £17,000 in today's prices. So that was quite a considerable contribution to allowing hospital patients to have a better time when they were in hospital. And there are all sorts of features on the day. The Essex Pipe Band marched through the town, and then it gave some demonstrations on the Fete Field. The Fete, of course, was held next to what was then the Archer Hall in what was the football field used by Billericay Town Football Club. But of course, this was in the summer, and it was opened by the matron, and she was introduced by Mr. S.T. Squires, who was a very well-known figure in the town, through his shop. And there were all sorts of displays of country dancing by local schools, and there was a fancy dress parade which was judged by Dr. and Mrs. Rillstone, who were prominent figures in the town. He was one of the town's doctors. So this was really quite a major event for the town, particularly as this was happening before we actually had the Billericay Carnival starting up again. So if I turn to the next page of the paper, it talks about an inner relief road plan for Billericay. Now, fortunately, this plan never came to fruition, because I think it would have been quite disastrous for the town if it had done so, and probably wouldn't have done much to relieve traffic congestion either. And the plan was to widen the top end of Chapel Street, the end towards the South End Road, and then to construct a new road which would have gone just behind properties on the lower end of Chapel Street, which I think would have made those completely unlivable. Now, there was obviously a lot of discussion and debate about this, and there was already a lot of resistance to this proposal. And as I say, fortunately, it never came to be, because I think it would not have been good for the town and wouldn't have solved any of the problems. Now, the story on the third page is in many ways quite important, because the local elections had just been held, and this had resulted in Basildon Urban District Council having a hung council, because the Residents' Association had won the Billericay seats, or at least 4 of those 5 Billericay seats at the time, and this meant that neither Labour or the Conservatives had a majority, and therefore the question was, who was going to be elected as chairman. And in effect, what happened was that the Residents' Association did a deal with the Conservatives, much to the annoyance of Labour, who were hoping to form a minority administration. And this meant that Councillor A.P. Phelps, who was the only remaining Conservative member for Billericay, was elected the chairman. Now, Councillor Phelps was actually proprietor of the Ritz Cinema in Chapel Street in Billericay, which later became a bingo hall, but at that time it was quite a popular place for people to go to watch films. The programme changed 3 times a week, and he also owned the Radian Cinema in Leamington. So he was quite a popular figure in the town, and he was elected as the chairman of the council. And of course, then as part of the deal, what happened was that Councillor Wilkins, who was the senior representative for the Residents' Association in Billericay, became chair of the Key Finance Committee. So, in fact, that was fine as far as the Conservatives were concerned, but of course, obviously, the Labour members of the council weren't too happy about that. Turning on, there's an editorial well, it's not really editorial, it's really about publicising certain other publications. And in particular, it's publicising the first of the Billericay history series. Now, I think you also find you can access all these booklets in digital format online through the community archive. The first one was early Billericay, which was about Roman Billericay, and then there were other ones about the mills of Billericay and the Mayflower, which of course is something we've heard about again recently. Billericay's markets and fairs, and of course the Inns of Billericay, which was one of the most popular of these booklets. And they started actually to do really quite well. In fact, sold thousands of copies, so they obviously met some kind of need that people had for histories. And in particular, there was also a short history of Billericay, which was quite popular. It's quite interesting to look at some little adverts on the right-hand side of this particular page. And for example, there's someone who's offering oven-ready hens, which are advertised at only 2 shillings and twopence a pound, which is claimed are cheaper than sausages. Also, he was selling rabbits of all ages, and there was also various vegetables available, and pure organic potash, which was valuable for that. Down the bottom of the page, we find an advert for Goodspeeds at 1 Chapel Street, opposite the War Memorial, which was a long-established institution, but at that point in 1962, it had been established for 32 years, and often on the various pages on Facebook, they're concerned with Billericay, I see references to Goodspeeds because they were very popular, not just for their wet fish, but also they did provide a fish and chip service and stayed open on Fridays and Saturdays till 8 o'clock in the evening. So the adverts give some idea of the sorts of things that were available in the town at that day, time. And then, of course, we go on, there's the letters to the editor, someone complaining about whether in fact the paper had been right to criticise the amount of money that was spent on Basildon relative to Billericay, which was always a ready source of controversy. And then at the bottom of the page, we got the Billericay Hit Parade, which was provided by Stanwood Radio, who were there in the High Street in Billericay in those days. And we find that Good Luck Charm by Elvis Presley is the #1, followed by I'm Looking Out of the Window and Do You Want to Dance by Cliff Richard, As You Like It, Adam Faith, and Come Outside, Mike Sarn. So that was also quite a popular feature. Turning over the page, there's an advertisement for the Woolpack, which was situated at 3 Chapel Street in one of the old Tudor buildings in Billericay. And that was certainly a popular place for people who wanted to, get their wool and other things for knitting. And then there's a history article on Tudor and Stuart Billericay. And that led me to think a little bit about the history of Billericay, which I'd attempted to summarise in the short history of Billericay as well as I could. I think if one was trying to treat the history of Billericay thematically, and of course one of the big issues is where did this rather unusual name of Billericay come from? I mean, I always favoured the explanation that it was actually a corruption of Ville de Cray, which is a name reflecting one of the early medieval families, and also was present in the name of Crays Hill. But it's really all speculation. There's lots of alternative explanations of where the name came from. But I think if one was going to look at this thematically, what strikes me as the sort of main explanation are changes in modes of transport over the years, modes of communication. I mean, originally, of course, Billericay was granted a charter for a market and also for annual fairs, which were really, one of the main contributors to its prosperity at that time, and obviously brought people into the town on a regular basis and supported a lot of local tradesmen at the time. And of course, the fact that you had this market reflected the difficulty of travelling, particularly in the winter, and the roads were extremely bad. They became flooded very easily, almost impassable, and there were problems about bridging rivers. So in fact, people couldn't travel a long distance very easily, and that's why you needed a whole series of local markets, of which Billericay was one. Now, because what happened in the 18th century was that you had the construction of the turnpike roads, which really transformed means of road transport. And then, of course, the market in Billericay started to decline because it could no longer compete with the bigger markets that were held further afield, and people could now get to these rather than coming to the somewhat smaller market at Billericay. So that really marked a period almost of decline in the town, or at least of decreased prosperity. And again, what transformed, I think, the town's fortunes was the arrival of the railway, which, I mean, needn't necessarily have come via Billericay. One of the original plans was for it to go via Stock, to run by the bottom of the hill at Stock, but it did come, the line did come to Billericay. I wouldn't say initially when it came, it made a great transformation. The real transformation, of course, was when the line was electrified in the late 1950s and made Billericay very attractive as a commuter destination for people living in London. And that is really the change that produced the modern Billericay we knew today. It started off a very rapid expansion of the population of the town. So I think, if you want a very short summary of the history of Billericay, what you can do is to try and explain it in terms of changes in the modes of transport over time. So the paper goes on. There are more advertisements, but on one of the sad things which is recorded in this issue is the funeral of Mrs. A.M. Cater of Hill House in Stock Road, of course, whose name is commemorated in the Cater Museum, which she helped to set up. She had owned the Old Chambles Hotel in the High Street, and the Cater Museum was the gift she made to the town in memory of her husband. And she also provided a lot of money for improvements to Billericay Congregational Church and converted part of her home into flats for retired Baptist ministers. So she was quite a well-known figure in the town, and the fact, of her death was something that certainly wanted to be recorded. So you can see here encapsulated, I mean, there are obviously all sorts of other stories in the newspaper, some of the concerns that people had at that time, some of the interests that people had at that time. And of course, this led me to reflect a little bit, having found this issue, on the story of the Billericay Observer, which, as I've said, you can easily see the issues online. I think, because this issue appeared in June 1962, in fact, the newspaper closed in the end of that year, in December 1962, having been first established in 1958. So, there are a number of reasons it closed, but the principal one was that I was coming up to doing what were called O-levels at the time, now called GCSEs, and needed to focus on those. But I think looking back at the history of the paper, it wasn't really something which I had a strategic plan for. Initially, it was just a few copies were produced, carbon copies were produced, and circulated among a few neighbours and friends, and that seemed to get a reasonably good reception. So later on, I purchased what was called a duplicating machine. This technology is now long forgotten, but at one time offices were, this was the main means of reproduction in offices. It was before we had the Xerox machine, which of course completely supplanted the duplicator. And so I got what was called a Roneo, which was one of the two main makes, but one which you had to operate by hand, and you typed all the material onto stencils, which were essentially a sort of kind of wax paper, and then put them on the drum of the machine and then turn the handle. And then eventually, in time, as the paper continued to grow, I replaced this with a Gestetner, an electric machine. And again, the Gestetner company was very well known. Indeed, I attended some commemorations for the Gestetner company in East London the other year. So in a sense, that of course made it possible to produce a large number of copies of the paper, and at the peak it was selling about 1,000 copies each issue, which I think suggested it did meet some kind of need in the town, in a sense that the other papers that served the area were published from other locations. I'm not to say that they didn't provide good coverage, but they were published from Southend or Chelmsford or Brentwood or wherever, so they weren't really based in the town. And I think there was a lot of news in the town at the time. I mean, essentially, I think the core story here is that, of course, Billericay had expanded very rapidly. Once the railway had been electrified, you then started to get large numbers of housing estates being built. I mean, when I moved to Billericay in 1956, it was still a relatively quiet kind of East Anglian town. I mean, there'd been some development, but it was on a relatively small scale. But once the electrification took place, you had this rapid expansion of the town, and that brought all sorts of problems, I think, in its train, all sorts of challenges that had to be faced up to, because of the strain that was put on amenities by this rapid expansion. I mean, one of the things, of course, that people of my generation can remember, but most people won't remember, is that a lot of the side streets were not made up. They were not, they didn't have any kind of proper road surface. And this meant in winter, in particular, they got into terrible condition because they were full of deep potholes which filled up with water. And, if you walked along them, certainly unless you're wearing Wellington boots, you get very, very muddy. So this was a real problem, and of course it cost quite a lot of money to actually do something about these roads, because it's quite a big job to actually bring them up to a modern standard. And I think in the first issue of my paper, I talked about the plans to improve the road called Lakeside, which was just off Perry Street. And in fact, in this issue, there are a number of references. When these roads were made up, the so-called frontages had to pay so much per foot as a contribution. The council provided some of the money, and there's a story, for example, in the paper about Hillside Road, which is was going to be made up, and the council had increased its contribution so that the frontages were only just going to have to pay over £3 a foot to contribute to the cost of making up the road. So, I mean, this was a really important thing to do, but it took some time to get through because there was such a backlog. Some of these roads had been opened up and way back and just had perhaps quite a few number of houses on them, but they simply didn't have any kinds of modern means of access. So that was one problem, because the street lighting was also an issue, and street lighting was very limited and often quite inefficient. It wasn't unusual to have power cuts in those days, certainly much more common than today. But there were a whole series of other problems, I think, that faced the town. One obviously was, you had a lot of relatively young, the people who moved in were generally relatively young. And of course, one of the things they did when they came to Billericay was they started, or perhaps had already started, a young family. And then, of course, there was the challenge of providing sufficient places in particularly in primary schools, but ultimately in secondary schools, because the Mayflower School had to be built to complement Billericay Secondary School. So there was this challenge of the class sizes in primary schools were often sizes that we would have found unacceptable today. So there are a whole series of these pressures that were being felt in the community to meet the sort of expectations that people generally moving from London had of the kinds of amenities and facilities they would find in a place like Billericay. And it was, I think, quite difficult looking back for the council with the resources available, and also having to cope with Basel and Newtown to do this perhaps at the speed that satisfied people. I mean, another issue was, a lot of these roads didn't have any pavements. The roads which were made up and traffic didn't have any pavements, and as the traffic increased, it was actually satisfaction among voters and among residents at the standard of facilities that were being provided. So I think all these things came together, and they created a situation where there were plenty of news stories for me to write about, covering the local council, covering lots of local associations. I mean, there's a very active, environment of local associations, and I published a Billericay reference book which listed all these associations. Lots of stories. There was never any difficulty really in finding enough to fill the paper, perhaps in August when people were away on holiday, but for the rest of the year it was possible to provide a paper which sold well. And I think because the other thing that helped the newspaper was the sort of publicity it attracted. There were a number of television appearances I did particularly on a program called Tonight, which was a popular current affairs program in the early evening in those days, but also radio, and there's also a lot of press publicity. And every time you had one of these things, or there's also, of course, Pathé News did a newsreel, which again is something you can find online, which has some, obviously pictures of me trying, pretending to do reporting and sell advertising and sell the newspaper. And of course, one of the interesting things about that is you see a lot of views of the town in the background, and that was a colour production. So all this publicity, I think, helped to get the paper well known, helped the sales of the paper. It would have been practically very difficult to produce, I think, much more than 1,000 copies. We did 1,200 for the 100th issue, but even with the electric duplicator, it took a time to run it off, and then of course it had to be collated and stapled, which was a bigger job, and it had to be distributed around the town to various news agents, and I also sold it outside the Billericay railway station. So I think it was the maximum of what one could do with that kind of duplicated newsletter format. Essentially, these days, because you do everything online, and in many senses that would be much easier. So at the end of 1962, I closed the paper, but I went on to work for the Brentwood Gazette on a part-time basis, providing what they call their Billericay notes for a few years until I went to university. So in a sense, I continued to provide the news coverage in a different format. And, lots of people seem to remember the newspaper today, and, I often get inquiries about it and so on. And of course, I would be very happy to answer any questions that people have got. I understand that there's going to be a comment section linked with this particular presentation, and that you can go there and put any questions you've got, and I will be happy to do my very best to answer them. Questions about the history of Billericay, or what Billericay was like in the late 50s and 1960s, questions about the Billericay Observer, whatever it is that you want me to try and answer, I'll do my best to answer those questions, because it's all a long time ago, but I think one's memory often of events that a long time ago is often still quite good, or it can be stimulated in various ways. So I've been very pleased to do this presentation today, but I think I've said most of what I want to say. So at this point, I'm going to conclude, and thank you for watching and listening.